Now, let me just get myself set up and start my timer. So, yes, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview about some Blackboard things in terms of accessibility beyond Ally, and particularly referring to the responsive theme. I thought I'd set the scene by talking about these new accessibility regulations we mentioned earlier in Laura's presentation and their global context and future direction, because I think there's a lot of really interesting things going on. And then to share with you some of the work I've been doing, particularly in terms of color contrast and focus indicators, and also to talk about the enhanced AT bar I'll be launching on the community site soon. Everything that I'm talking about refers to the 2016 responsive theme for the original experience for Learn. And as Amy said, it's not particularly about the mobile app, but the responsive interface does make Blackboard better for use on a mobile device. And if you're watching this remotely, you might want to close the sidebar and press F11 to maximize the space available to see the slides. Because I'm talking about some legal things, this is not legal advice. And of course, learning about accessibility is a journey for us all, and I'm on my own stage of this journey. It's possible I've misunderstood some things, so I'm sure Lillian will correct me if I've misunderstood something as well. And also, I hope to develop this presentation for TLC this year, so do let me know anything you'd like that you found useful or things that you'd like to see included. Best to contact me is via LinkedIn. And I'm just going to tell you a bit about what these regulations are. So they're introduced in 2018 as a statutory instrument, the accessibility regulations. And I found that there was a lot of mixed messages about what was involved with these regulations. So I started reading them all and all of the paperwork, and I found that you really have to also look at the Equality Act and Disability Discrimination Act to understand all of the language that they use. And of course, it comes from the European directive. And when you start reading that, it's about 30 pages and quite readable compared with the UK version. You see, it's actually part of their digital agenda for Europe and a strategy for removing barriers. And they often mention the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities from the UN back in 2006. So this is all part of quite a global movement. In terms of what actual guidelines we need to be following, it's actually called Standard EN 301549, which is based on the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which I'll be referring to as WCAG for now. And those are used in lots of other pieces of legislation, such as the 508 Act in America. You might have heard on the news, particularly with regard to Domino's Pizzas, about the Americans with Disabilities Act. That doesn't actually refer to WCAG, but it is quite relevant at the moment. And there's now an ISO standard which uses WCAG. So it's really moving on quite a lot. There's a brilliant document from JISC prepared by John Kelly that will tell you a lot more. So I recommend that, and these slides will be available after the presentation. And make sure that you're subscribing to JISC's brilliant accessibility regulations mailing list, which is incredibly useful. The Government Digital Service will be monitoring compliance with the regulations from about April onwards. In their webpage for institutions, for educational institutions, they said organisations might want to seek legal advice if they're unsure of their position. This was echoed in UCISA's document, The Director's Cut, which is an incredibly good 6-page overview. And they say that there's the prospect of multiple institutions spending money on the same or even contradictory legal advice. And that came back to me when I was reading a bit more about the Domino's case in the US, where they were trying to get the Supreme Court to throw out a case against them for their website and app being inaccessible. And this lady, Whitney Quisenberry from the Centre for Civic Design, was saying that Domino's were effectively suing for the right to discriminate. And I hope that with lots of universities taking legal advice, that they don't all end up spending a lot of money trying to justify not having to comply with the regulations, when it'd probably be much more effective just to get on and comply and make sure that we're removing barriers to all that might experience them in accessing our services. But let's continue on our journey. It is a worldwide concept. There's lots of regulations coming up around the world that do similar things. And there's continual momentum. For example, the European Accessibility Act is going to come into effect from the 28th of June 2025, and that covers quite a few more wider areas. So there's certainly a lot of movement in this area coming along. And also the standards that we need to be following, those are being updated. They're now effectively compliant with WCAG 2.1, and hopefully the technical write-ups will be made into the formal mandate document in the EU quite soon. And WCAG is developing as well. 2.2 should be out in November, and the next generation of accessibility guidelines is expected to be released in 2022. So this is certainly an area which is going to be developing an awful lot. Who benefits from all of these regulations? Well, hopefully everyone agrees that everyone will be benefiting. And you might have seen slides such as this where we not only think of permanent and temporary impairments, but also situational ones, which I'll mention those a little bit later on as well, some examples. Coming back to Blackboard, when we upgraded last year, we wanted to implement the responsive theme, and we wanted it to be both on brand using our institutional color scheme, but also compliant with the accessibility regulations, and at the very least no worse than it is out of the box when provided by Blackboard. And the first area I'm going to look at is colour contrast. 2 million people in the UK live with a visual impairment, and almost 5% are colourblind. And we also have situational visual impairments where, for example, using a screen in a bright light or projector screen in a very well-lit room can be hard to see. And the greater the contrast between colours we use there is, the more likely we are to be able to view the materials. And in terms of some of what the regulations are, in terms of non-text contrast, such as graphical objects like the one you see here, the requirement is that there's a contrast ratio of at least 3:1. So the difference between one color that you use and the color next to it has to have a ratio of 3:1 at least. I'll tell you a bit more about color contrast shortly. That also applies for user interface components. So for example, where we see these icons above the course menu in Blackboard, this light blue is part of our institutional color scheme, but it would not be sufficient for showing contrast for graphical elements, whereas this darker blue color is, and you can see the ratios presented there. Also, we need to think about text and images of text. And for those, we, at a minimum, need to satisfy a contrast ratio of at least 4.5:1. And for the enhanced AAA level, it's 7:1. So where we have buttons that include text in the interface, that light blue, that would not be suitable. But this darker blue is much more suitable. It's a much higher contrast ratio and it's easier to see. The numbers you need to remember, 3:1 is the minimum for graphical objects, 4.5:1 is the minimum for text, and 7:1 is the enhanced level, that's the AAA level. How is color contrast calculated? Well, it involves working out what the relative luminance of two colors is and then comparing them. It isn't too difficult maths to follow, but usually we would use an online color checker. And my favorite one at the moment is whocanuse.com, which is set up by Corey Ginnivan, who's based in Perth, Australia. Not only will it tell you the contrast ratio and the WCAG rating of a color combination, it also tells you how those will look for people with different visual impairments. And it also talks about situational impairments. So that's my favorite one for checking out color contrasts. And by the way, the whole topic of color contrast turned out to be quite complex, and they're looking at, for the next generation of accessibility guidelines, of having a whole new way of calculating it. There's a very interesting thread about it on GitHub just here. But once we start implementing in Blackboard, we find further complexity. If you're new to customizing the theme, you can see a video of the talk that Esther Sam and I gave at the TLC last year about customizing the theme. So if you're new to that, check that presentation out now on YouTube. But in Blackboard, often we want to have the state of an icon or interface aspect change when we hover over it. So we need to not only consider the color in its normal state, but also when we hover, and that there's sufficient change in the colors that we can tell that we're hovering, but also that the hover state has the correct level of color contrast as well. And for example, in the control panel, when we select users and groups to expand that area, that text changes color. So we need to make sure that all of the colors are correct and have the right color contrast in the contexts in which the interface will put them. And it can get even more complex, like button 4 in Blackboard is the cancel button in some areas, it's the go button in other areas. Sometimes it will have a white area around it, sometimes it's within the control panel. So you need to understand all of the context that your interface components will appear in. And if you're thinking, sounds all quite complicated, Matt, wouldn't it be easier if we just went with the out-of-the-box settings? Well, actually, some of the out-of-the-box settings don't quite meet the accessibility criteria either. The edit mode, the grey and the white, is not quite enough color contrast to satisfy WCAG. You can pretty much immediately see from this receipt message that the contrast isn't great and would also fail. And just recently in Blackboard's roadmap, they showed this example of their enhanced grade center, which shows a lot of quite poor color contrast issues as well. So if you are completely new to this, there's a fantastic browser plugin called Accessibility Insights, which you can install into Chrome or the Chromium version of Edge. And that will do a lot of these types of checks for you, including color contrast, and it's free. So I really recommend installing that and having a go around your university websites and your services and so on. Now, when we were implementing the responsive theme, we wanted to use our institutional color scheme. I'm sure most institutions have an international brand or color scheme like this. And at first we were looking them up individually, which is quite onerous. And after a while, I decided I would have a go at making a big matrix that listed all of the possible colors in our institutional brand, and when they were combined, whether they would satisfy AA or AAA or graphical criteria under WCAG. And because I made this as a script, if your institution would have any value from having a similar matrix, just let me know and I could set one up for you. Best to contact me via LinkedIn. It also produces examples of each color combination so you can see what they would look like, which we found to be very useful the further we went. Summarizing, customizing colors in Blackboard theme isn't exactly simple, but there is a lot of help on the community site and the presentation we gave last year. But doing so does empower you to be sure that you're using the appropriate level of contrast in all cases, while making sure that your Blackboard environment matches your institutional brand and therefore will look similar to your other websites, so everything appears coherent to students. Now you might also be thinking, but Matt, the course menus, can't instructors still change their color schemes even on the 2016 theme? And that is true. Although we had reset all of the color schemes to a AAA level, users will sometimes make choices which may not always be the best choices. For example, there's nothing stopping someone setting, or an instructor setting their course menu to have quite a poor color scheme. Some of the things that we've done to try and help our students work around that is we set that when you hover with the mouse over a menu point, over a course menu item, the background changes to white, the text changes to black and is emboldened, and that way if there's something you can't quite read when you hover your mouse over it, you will be able to read it. And we've done the same for keyboard navigation. As you tab around the menu, the background color and text color will adjust so that it's readable. So in any circumstance, although it might not be ideal, there is always a workaround. And we've added this information, this coping strategy, into our accessibility statement. And talking of keyboard navigation, the next thing I wanted to talk about was focus indicators. These are the kind of boxes that you see around a web page as you use keyboard navigation to navigate a page. And you've probably all seen the Google front page from time to time. And when the text, or when you've clicked into that box or selected it, the focus indicator is in box shadow around the box. If I press Tab, it would then move to the highlight search by voice. And then the next tab is the Google search button. So wherever the focus indicator is, if I press enter, it would select that element on the web page. And keyboard navigation is not only to be used when you don't have a mouse. It's also used by screen readers, and of course power users love keyboard shortcuts as well. And if you use Blackboard and the default theme, the focus indicators tend to be purple, and they do have a good contrast ratio, but you do need to make sure that if you do make any changes that you are accounting for changes to the focus indicator, because in the European standard, which has the WCAG 2.0 setting saying that focus has to be visible, and in WCAG 2.1 they updated it to say that the visual focus indicator must have sufficient contrast to the background. So here's some examples where, as we had changed it in our Blackboard environment, we changed the focus indicators so that they looked good enough with the choices of color that we had used, and had sufficient contrast ratio, and that they were all adjusted and not the default purple ones. So we tended to try to make them quite large and as visible as possible. And if you do adjust your own Blackboard theme, it's almost inevitable that you'll have to deal with the focus indicators. Because, for example, where our default course menu has a white background, if you do nothing, the hover color is purple and the focus indicator color is purple, which have very low contrast ratios. And just to sum up, it's not just me saying that this is important. When you look at most accessibility cheat sheets and articles, you will find that one of the first things they talk about making sure you've got the right color contrast, and also that you've got good focus indicators. Also, what I said I'd also talk about is this enhanced AT bar. You might have seen on the community site I shared a JS hack to use the AT bar browser plugin with Blackboard. I've since been doing some work on expanding that so that it also includes some existing Blackboard accessibility features and a help section to explain what these new icons I've added are. The idea is to try to normalize the availability and visibility of accessibility tools and features, so they're not hidden away, they're easy to find, and they're coherent and consistent with our user interface. I'll be uploading this to the new community site once it's relaunched, and if you wanted to use it yourselves, you'd be able to change the colors and the style and the help content to suit your purposes. Just to explain what the items are, and I've got some animations that I'll show at the end of the presentation that will kind of give a quick demo of it. Skip to content isn't actually accessible by mouse on Blackboard, and it isn't visible either. It's just the first tab and then pressing enter. Skip to content is very useful because it allows you to skip navigation links like the course menu and go straight into content. And when you're using the keyboard navigation, it's really helpful to be able to go straight into the content. Likewise, quick links, you might recognize that chain or link icon in Blackboard's top left corner. I actually started on looking at trying to make that icon a bit more coherent with the style that we were using in Blackboard, which is how I ended up putting this into an enhanced AT bar. When you open quick links, it sets up a section of page landmarks and headings, which will make keyboard navigation much faster. Also, the AT bar, that is unchanged from before, it's still the same AT bar. Just to give you an overview of some of its features, it allows you to change font size without changing the size of images, which is what would happen if you were using Control plus, Control minus, or hold down Control and using the mouse wheel. Change the font style and line spacing. Line spacing is quite important for dyslexic users. It's better to have an increase in the line spacing. There's a text-to-speech feature. You can change some of the colors of text and links, and also use color overlays to reduce visual stress. And the help section then explains what these extra icons are, and I've used it not only to explain the enhanced AT bar, but also to provide links to accessibility related information, like links to our enabling services team, links to what assistive technology our students can download, like the JAWS screen reader and so on, and links to how they can access our assistive technology suite. And once I've uploaded that to the community site, I look forward to hear any feedback. And what I'm thinking to do next is to make a mobile version, because we had that fantastic presentation from Kimberly at Blackboard last couple of months ago, who said that quick links weren't available in the mobile theme. And so once I've worked out where the space will be to put this in the mobile theme, I'll try and set up the AT bar to work with that as well. You can find out more, including introductory video, online. And that's just to round up. I've tried to set the scene, tell you about some of these regulations and where they are in the global context, and show you a few indicators. And I've pretty much only gone 1 minute over time. So while you ask me any questions, do remember to send me some feedback on the presentation, and I'll try and load up a few animations to show you some examples of what I've been talking about. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Matt. Take a moment to breathe and have something to drink.
Yes.
No, so that was really interesting, and I know it's something that between intrigued by all the things that you've applied at Southampton. Yes, okay, here's one of the gifts. Do you want to talk through these?
Yeah, so this one, I'm not quite sure if you see exactly the same point as I see, but the GIF will repeat. So first of all, it shows when you hover, that bad menu color scheme changing, and then once it's gone through using the mouse, it then shows you what it looks like using the focus indicator and using keyboard navigation. So it's much easier when you can show, but because I wanted to upload my slides to be played direct in Collaborate, it doesn't let you show embedded GIFs, so that's why I'm showing these separately. And I'll just upload the next one.
Oh, that's great, thank you. Yeah, so it's interesting to see these things in action. And if you've been following the text chat during that call, my colleague Lillian has mentioned that yes, at York in particular, we are, I don't know what the correct word is, but we are never-endingly trying to deal with the purple focus box, and the fact that subheaders, for example, in a VLE site left-hand menu will not change from white no matter what you change the site colors to, and things like that. So it's definitely something we've been fighting with too. Sorry.
Yeah, the subheader is incredibly annoying. We've set it to be hard-coded to black text, but because most of our course menus are white, have a white background, but still when people want to change their colors, if they want to have something where black doesn't contrast well, then they're out of luck because it's hard coded. So I know that there's some improvements that Blackboard are talking about in updated versions of the themes. Just to tell you what you're seeing here is the focus indicator also appears when you click on something with the mouse, which you've probably seen in general, but because we've made these a bit larger and more visible, I like to think that for users who have a slower computer or poor broadband, it's quite nice to know, like, yes, I have definitely clicked on that. You get that extra visual indicator. So I think it also has an extra benefit, not only for people who use keyboard navigation. I'm just going to upload the next one. This is a demonstration of skip to content. Not sure whereabouts it starts for everyone, but once it starts, you tab into skip to content. When you press enter, it immediately brings you down to where the content begins, so that when you use keyboard navigation, you're straight into the content rather than having to go through the course menu and the top tab navigation and so on. And now I'm going to just share the last one, which is a demonstration of quick links. So how this works is once you open up quick links, it will show a list of headings on the current page, and then you can use your keyboard navigation to tab through those and quickly find what you're interested in, select it, and then once it's selected, it takes you direct to that page and it briefly flashes the title of the content that you had moved into. So I'll stop talking now.
No, that's great, Matt. Thank you very much. All very interesting. I'd say, yeah, we've definitely encountered similar problems to you, but we're very impressed at the things you've implemented already. Anyone have any questions? I can see there's one in the chat there from Gizzy about, is there any way to set a style for the whole BB site by users that they would prefer, even if limited to, say, 5 or 6 different options? All right, so you're giving people the choice of how to display things themselves.
Yeah, I think I don't have a way at the moment, but I've been really getting into using JS Hack at the moment, and that is really good for adding extra CSS. So I think you could set that up. It would take quite a lot of work to make up those different themes, but it is theoretically possible to do. And using JS Hack, it shouldn't be too difficult. Be a little bit of JavaScript and making the CSS. So I think it would be possible. It's a nice idea, something to look at. If I ever get time, I'd definitely like to look into doing something like that. And if I do, I'll let everyone at Moco know about it.
Thank you. Am I right in thinking that the inbuilt accessibility features for Blackboard Learn, if your student accesses them from the menu in the top right, the My Blackboard menu, I think you've got the option of applying your own machine's contrast settings and things there, don't you, as well? So rather than going in and picking a certain setting, I think an individual can choose to replicate their machine's, like, Windows operating system settings within Learn, but I haven't tested that myself. My colleague
Yeah,
Lillian.
it does let you use your operating system's high contrast mode, but sometimes sometimes you get unexpected consequences when you use those, but that might also be related to any CSS changes you make as an institution compared with what Blackboard provide out of the box. But it's not something I've looked at enough lately. So I have tested that it works, but I've not gone much further.
Lovely. We've got a few minutes left before break time. Has anyone got anything else they would like to ask in the room or virtually? Give you a second. Okay. Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you very, very much for that, Matt. That was really, really interesting. And as I say, we will share these recordings and slides and things post-event. There's been people excitedly taking photos in the row here at Durham, so yeah, we will we'll share the slides and things afterwards.